The moment Seth Hadley read the address aloud, from the sealed envelope in his lap, Lauren Stanhope's hand went still on the door handle of his truck, and the rain hammering the windshield seemed to go quiet for the space of a single breath. He repeated it without being asked, turning the envelope in his work-roughened hands and reading each number the same unhurried way he seemed to read everything, without drama, without inflection, as though the coincidence itself did not yet require comment. 1144 Claiborne Ridge Road, Harlan County, Tennessee. Arrival no later than 7 o'clock in the evening. Lauren had memorized that address from her own letter 4 days ago. She had not told a single person where she was going today. If you love stories about quiet strength, unexpected connections, and justice that arrives in its own time, tap subscribe so you never miss what comes next on this channel. Lauren had left Nashville at noon alone, driving herself for the first time in 3 years because the letter she carried had left no room for interpretation. It had arrived on ivory paper, sealed with a notary's stamp and the crest of the Blythe family, and it addressed her by name, by title, and by the specific capacity in which the late Harrison Blythe had known her company as a steward of something worth protecting. Harrison Blythe had died 6 weeks earlier, quietly, the way men of his particular generation preferred to leave the world. He had spent 40 years designing water infrastructure for communities too small and too poor to attract anyone else's attention. His company, Blythe Water Technologies, had produced a predictive software system called HydroMap that Lauren's company, Meridian Environmental Group, now held commercial rights to. HydroMap could identify municipal water main failures before they happened, modeling infrastructure decay with a precision that existing systems could not come close to matching. It should have been transformative for hundreds of small communities across the rural South and Midwest by now. Instead, it sat legally encumbered by the very debt Meridian had taken on to acquire it, while Pierce Rollins and his firm, Rollins Capital Group, waited patiently for the moment Meridian's balance sheet cracked under the weight. The letter had promised Lauren that whatever waited at Claiborne Ridge could change the terms of that arrangement entirely. It had also warned that if she failed to arrive by 7, the opportunity would pass to someone else. And she had read that sentence 3 times without needing to be told who that someone else was. She made it through Nashville and through the Cumberland foothills without incident. It was somewhere past the junction with Route 421 that her GPS rerouted her onto a secondary road due to flooding upstream, and it was on that secondary road, past a stand of yellow-leafed sycamores, that the Meridian Company sedan rolled to a stop on the gravel shoulder in the early afternoon rain and refused, after 8 attempts, to start again. Lauren stood in the drizzle and stared at her phone, which showed 1 bar of signal and a map that had no idea how far she was from anywhere. She called her CFO, Dean Faber, who told her to stay calm and offered to dispatch a car from Knoxville, at least 90 minutes away. She declined and ended the call, and stood there long enough for the rain to move from drizzle to something more committed before headlights appeared in her mirror, cresting the rise from the south. The truck that pulled over behind her was the kind of vehicle that accumulates character rather than acquiring it. An older Chevrolet Silverado, the paint faded in patches that suggested long summers rather than neglect. The bed carrying aluminum equipment cases and a coil of survey tape strapped under a tarp. The man who climbed out wore a canvas jacket and work boots and moved through the rain with the unhurried ease of someone who had long since made peace with weather as a permanent condition of life rather than an inconvenience to be minimized. He said his name was Seth. He asked if she wanted him to take a look. He spent 4 minutes under the hood. He emerged with the diagnosis delivered in the flat, considered tone of someone reporting a result rather than offering a theory. A failure in the vehicle's electronic control module, the failure pattern inconsistent with normal wear, the system unrepairable on the roadside. He said it with the same certainty Lauren might use to report a quarterly revenue figure, and she noticed, even through her frustration, that he had not used a single word she needed to translate. She asked if he could drive her. He was already running late for somewhere he needed to be, he said. But he agreed anyway. The cab of the Silverado smelled like machine oil and cedar, and the faint sweetness of a child's fruit snack. The foil wrapper tucked into the cup holder, alongside a thermos and a folded topographic map. On the back seat, a girl's wool jacket was bunched against a backpack printed with mountain wildflowers, and a school library book lay face down on top of it, spine cracked from use. Lauren understood without asking that he was raising a child alone. She did not ask about the child's other parent. She checked her watch twice in the first 10 minutes. On the third check, she offered Seth an amount of money, named directly and without apology, if he would be willing to drive faster. The roads were wet and the curves were blind, he said, and no appointment in the world was worth a rollover on a mountain road. She heard herself make a sharp remark about the difficulty of understanding high-stakes responsibility for people who had never had to carry it at scale. He let the remark land and did not respond to it, which she found somehow worse than an argument would have been. They drove in silence for a while. The hills outside were the kind of beautiful that announces itself without asking for acknowledgement. Ridgelines in late October amber above the cloud line. A creek running fast and brown in the valley below. Lauren stopped checking her watch. When Seth mentioned, in passing, a failure mode in Hydromap's third-generation pressure modeling that had been introduced during a recalibration, 2 years after the original architecture was completed, Lauren turned in her seat and looked at him directly for the first time. She asked him how he knew about Hydromap. He said he had worked in water systems engineering before his life changed direction. He offered nothing more, and his eyes stayed on the road. Lauren filed this away, alongside the precise and fluent explanation he had given for her vehicle's failure and the topographic survey map in the glove box, and she began the quiet recalculation that the situation now seemed to require. Her phone caught a signal on the upslope of a ridge. 3 messages arrived simultaneously. The most urgent was from Dean Faber, warning her that Pierce Rollins had already arrived at Claiborne Ridge and was growing impatient, urging her in the careful language he reserved for situations that had moved beyond what spreadsheets could contain to sign whatever terms were placed before her tonight, rather than risk losing the negotiation entirely. She noticed from the edge of her vision that Seth's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the wheel when Rollins's name moved through the truck cab. He said nothing. Lauren noticed. She asked Seth where he was headed. He reached into the breast pocket of his canvas jacket and produced a sealed envelope. He held it out without comment. Lauren took it, looked at the address printed on the front, set it down, asked him to pull over. He did. She opened her own envelope, held the two side by side in the gray afternoon light coming through the rain-streaked windshield, and read them twice before her hands stilled in her lap. Same address, same date, same time, same notary crest. The Blythe family's mark in gold and black on ivory paper. The only difference she could find was in the designations printed beneath each name. Hers read, Commercial Steward of the Estate. His read, Technical Guardian of the Primary Architecture. Lauren had spent 17 years reading contracts. She had never once encountered that designation. She asked Seth if he understood what it meant. He said Harrison Blythe had once been his employer. He said he did not fully understand the designation, only that he had received the letter 3 weeks ago and had spent those 3 weeks deciding whether to come. He had decided this morning. He said it simply, and did not elaborate on what the decision had cost him, though Lauren heard something in the tone that suggested it had not been a small thing. She studied his face in the fading light and reached, reluctantly, for the memory that had been pulling at her since she first heard him describe Hydra maps, pressure modeling failure. 7 years ago, a water main failure in a small town in northern Georgia had flooded 43 homes and destroyed the community's historic water treatment facility. The engineering firm responsible had faced investigation, and the lead systems modeler had been suspended and then quietly erased from the industry. Her predecessor at Meridian had mentioned the name once, in the context of the Blythe acquisition, as the name that appeared in the liability record. The engineer's name had been Hadley. Lauren looked at the man beside her for a long moment before she looked away. Seth Hadley pulled the truck back onto the road and drove the rest of the way up Claiborne Ridge without speaking, and Lauren sat with her hands folded in her lap and tried to understand what it meant that the man who had supposedly destroyed a town's water supply with negligent modeling was sitting beside her with a topographic survey map in his glove box and hands so steady on the wheel they barely moved at all. The gates of the Claiborne Ridge estate opened to reveal a gravel drive lined with the kind of black SUVs that people with serious money use to signal they do not need to signal anything. Seth guided the Silverado through them and parked at the end of the row, the old truck sitting among the fleet like something that had wandered in from a different era. A staff member crossed the gravel before they had fully stepped out. He addressed Lauren by her full title and waved her toward the entrance with the practiced courtesy reserved for people whose names appear in earnings reports. He looked at Seth, at the truck, at the aluminum cases in the bed, and asked if he was with the delivery that had been expected that afternoon. Before Seth could answer, Pierce Rollins appeared on the front steps. He was a tall man, silver-haired, the kind of physical presence that fills a room before its owner begins to speak. He welcomed Lauren with expansive warmth and the easy vocabulary of a man who has spent decades making difficult situations feel like conversations he has already won. Then he turned to Seth and reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded bill, 2 of them, and pressed them toward him with the suggestion that he park around by the service gate where the catering vehicles had come in. Seth looked at the money without taking it. He said he had been invited. Pierce Rollins's smile widened by precisely the increment required to communicate that he found this mildly amusing and did not believe it. He suggested to Lauren, in a tone calibrated to sound like friendly concern, that the man was likely attempting to use her goodwill for access, and that she ought not to feel obligated simply because he had been helpful on the road. He said this in front of 3 estate staff members and 2 of his own, and Lauren watched Seth absorb it with an expression that did not change at all. Not by tightening, not by going flat, not by any of the small betrayals of dignity that most people cannot fully prevent when they are publicly diminished. Lauren did not defend him. Her silence was a choice she registered making in real time, and she was not comfortable with it. She was still deciding what to say when the estate's front door opened and a woman in a charcoal suit stepped onto the portico with the kind of authority that does not announce itself, because it does not require announcement. The woman crossed the gravel directly to Seth Hadley, extended her hand, introduced herself as Vera Holcomb, estate attorney for Harrison Blythe, and said clearly enough for the entire courtyard to hear that she had been waiting specifically for his arrival, and that the proceedings could not begin without him. Then she turned to Pierce Rollins, and in exactly the same tone, informed him that the seat reserved at the head of the conference table tonight belonged to Seth Hadley, and that he would need to find another place to sit. The 2 men from Rollins' team who had begun moving toward the truck went still. The staff members who had smiled at the parking suggestion arranged their faces into expressions suggesting they had not smiled at all. Lauren Stanhope felt the ground shift beneath the assumptions she had built about this evening, because it was becoming clear that the man she had spent most of the afternoon dismissing was, in fact, the reason this gathering had been convened at all. Inside the library of Claiborne Ridge Estate, Harrison Blythe's voice came through a speaker at the center of the long conference table, recorded 6 months before his death, and left with Vera Holcomb to be played at this precise moment with these precise people present. His voice was thin but steady, the voice of a man who had decided not to waste whatever time remained on indirection. He said that Hydromap's foundational architecture had been designed by Seth Hadley. He said it plainly, without qualification. Seth had built the predictive failure modeling system at the core of the technology while working for Blythe Water Technologies. And when the Georgia incident had been investigated 7 years ago, the data that implicated Seth's modeling had been falsified. Harrison Blythe said he had known this at the time. He said he had stayed silent because defending Seth publicly would have cost the company its investment partnership with Rollins Capital Group, a partnership Blythe Water Technologies needed to survive. He said this without softening it, the way a man speaks near the end of his life, when the cost of softening things has finally exceeded the cost of truth. Seth listened with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on the speaker. He did not react with relief or with the visible release of a man hearing what he has waited years to hear. He looked to Lauren, like a person receiving news that had arrived too late to serve the purpose for which it was most needed. The recording laid out the will's terms. Seth would hold technical guardianship over Hydromap, sole authority over its engineering integrity and safety certification. Lauren would hold commercial guardianship, authority over licensing and market deployment. Neither could act without the other's written agreement. If they failed to reach terms by noon the following day, Hydromap would transfer to a nonprofit engineering trust and remain out of commercial use for a decade. Pierce Rollins offered Seth $8 million for the guardianship rights before Vera Holcomb had finished reading the trust provision. The offer sat in the room like something dropped from a considerable height. Seth said no. He said it quietly and without drama, and the refusal seemed to unsettle Pierce Rollins more than any counter-proposal could have. Vera Holcomb led Seth and Lauren down through a concealed staircase behind the estate's secondary library into a basement workspace that smelled like sealed air and old servers. Harrison Blythe's private laboratory had been maintained exactly as he had left it. Computing equipment along the stone walls, a central workstation with 3 monitors, and at the far end of the room, Hydromap's original processing prototype, its casing worn smooth from years of testing. Seth crossed to the workstation without being directed. He sat down and entered a startup sequence from memory, his fingers moving with the ease of someone returning to a language they had spoken fluently and never forgotten. The monitors came to life in sequence, and Lauren watched the system load and understood, with a clarity that had been building since the truck cab on the mountain road, that she was watching a man return to work that had always belonged to him. He found the modification within 20 minutes. It had been inserted into Hydromap's failure prediction algorithm sometime after Seth's departure from the company 7 years earlier. The change reduced the system's safety threshold margins in exchange for faster processing speed, shaving seconds off response times in a way that would be invisible in standard testing and catastrophic under extended real-world deployment. Across a national rollout, managing water supply for communities of tens of thousands, the gap between a missed failure prediction and a flooded neighborhood was exactly as small as it appeared on the screen. Lauren understood immediately what she was looking at. She had been days away from signing the accelerated deployment framework. Pierce Rollins had been advocating for 18 months. They worked through the night. Lauren brought production timeline modeling and regulatory expertise. Seth brought the deep technical fluency of the system's original author. They argued more than once. Lauren pushing for faster certification pathways, Seth refusing to move past lines she initially mistook for stubbornness before she understood they were mathematics. The disagreements were honest and they resolved them honestly, and somewhere around 2 in the morning, over coffee, from a thermos Seth had apparently anticipated needing. They began working in the easy, complementary way that only becomes possible after two people have stopped pretending to understand each other's domain better than they do. Lauren told him quietly that Meridian had 11 weeks of operating capital remaining. She had not told her own board yet. Seth told her he had lost his professional license, his home, and the life his daughter had known. He said the only thing that had kept him from accepting one of the quiet settlement arrangements Rollins's attorneys had offered over the years was that each one required signing a non-disclosure agreement, and he had promised himself after his wife, Nora, died that he would not make a single promise to his daughter that he could not keep, including the implicit one that her father was a man who did not sign away the truth for money. He said Nora's name simply, without ceremony. Lauren did not ask, but she heard it. The evidence was buried in an archived system log that Seth recognized not by its content but by the timestamp. The same week in which his professional license had been suspended, the same week in which the investigation's findings had been submitted. The electronic authorization attached to the modified code belonged to a user account registered under Dean Faber's credentials. The access log had been rerouted to obscure the origin point, but the original timestamp had survived in the backup archive, and the account number was unambiguous. Seth turned the monitor toward Lauren without a word, and she looked at it for a long time before she looked at him. Dean Faber had worked alongside Lauren for 11 years. He had been present at every crisis, every difficult decision, every late evening when the company's future had felt uncertain. She had believed, with the particular certainty that develops slowly and without examination, that his loyalty was not contingent on circumstances. She called Faber down to the laboratory under the pretense of reviewing revenue modeling. She said nothing about the screen. She watched his face as the pretense narrowed to an impossibility, and then she watched what was underneath it when the performance dissolved. He did not maintain denial for long. What he attempted instead was the version of events in which Lauren was the one making a mistake, in which Seth had fabricated the log to extract a settlement, in which the evidence was precisely what a man with a grievance and 7 years of patience might construct. Pierce Rollins arrived moments later and endorsed this version loudly, and with the practiced authority of someone who has learned that volume can sometimes substitute for evidence. They offered her a clean exit. Faber produced a document that would transfer personal liability for any future hydromap failure onto Seth, absolving Meridian entirely. Rollins offered an extended debt arrangement that would give the company another full year of breathing room. Both deals required Lauren to step away from the man on the other side of the room, the man whose expertise they had spent the evening dismissing, and whose work had made the very system they were now fighting to control. Lauren read the liability document through once. Then she set it on the table and did not pick up the pen. She said she had watched enough companies build their futures on buried truths to know how that story ended, and that she was not interested in that ending. Pierce Rollins withdrew his debt extension offer before she had finished the sentence. The threat behind the withdrawal explicit. Rollins Capital would begin calling Meridian's outstanding debt instruments at the opening of business, and the company would be in receivership before the end of the week. Lauren heard the threat. She did not look away from it, and she did not move from where she was standing. When the laboratory servers went dark 20 minutes later, and the drive containing the archived log disappeared from the workstation, Lauren was the one who noticed the power failure was confined to a single circuit. Seth was the one who found the signal jamming unit tucked behind the access panel near the stairwell door. The hallway camera nearest the lab had been offline for 9 minutes, precisely the window during which the drive had been taken. Dean Faber could not produce a phone record, a witness, or any coherent explanation for his whereabouts during those 9 minutes that survived a second question. The drive was recovered from Pierce Rollins's own vehicle. Identified by a passive tracking signal, Seth had embedded in the device years before he had any reason to imagine he would need one. Rollins insisted, loudly, that someone had planted it to frame him. Seth explained, without raising his voice, exactly how the transmitter worked, when he had built it into the casing, and why the signal had led without ambiguity to the vehicle parked in the estate's private lot. There was nothing left after that for anyone to say. The Meridian board convened by video at 5 in the morning. Lauren looked like someone who had spent 7 hours underground searching for something that mattered, which was accurate. Pierce Rollins joined the call and told the board, with the polished confidence of a man who has handled bad news before, that Lauren had failed to secure the necessary guardianship rights and that her judgment had been compromised by an outsider with no verified standing. He called for a vote to remove her as CEO. Several board members, their faces cautious in the small rectangles of the call interface, raised the question of whether the future of a major commercial technology should depend on the credibility of a man who currently ran an agricultural water consulting practice from a converted barn in eastern Tennessee. Seth presented the safety data without preamble and without the over-explanation that emerges from people uncertain of being believed. He walked the board through precisely what the modified algorithm would do under real-world conditions, what the failure rate implied for communities whose water supply it managed, and why the accelerated certification timeline Rollins had been advocating was not a shortcut but a guarantee of harm. He used exact numbers. He cited original design specifications. He answered every question that followed with the patience of someone who has explained difficult things to resistant audiences before, and has learned that the truth does not require ornamentation to hold its ground. Vera Holcomb presented the original patents, the employment records, and the legal framework of Harrison Blythe's will, establishing beyond institutional doubt that Seth Hadley was not merely qualified but legally and technically central to the entire technology in question. Lauren presented the financial trail she and Seth had recovered from the archived laboratory. Transaction records linking Dean Faber's account to a series of payments from a Rollins Capital subsidiary that predated the Georgia incident by 8 months. The board suspended Faber immediately and referred the financial irregularities to regulatory authorities without waiting for a second motion. Pierce Rollins began disconnecting from the call before the vote on Lauren's removal was completed. The motion failed. The board instead ratified the restructuring framework that Lauren and Seth had drafted on a yellow legal pad at Harrison Blythe's workstation in the hours before dawn. A framework that licensed Hydromap to Meridian Environmental under Seth Hadley's safety standards directed a portion of future revenues toward intellectual property restitution and opened the company to a new round of independent investors that Vera Holcomb had quietly positioned before the meeting began. Pierce Rollins lost before noon on a gray October morning in rural Tennessee, a deal he had been engineering for 6 years. The public record of the Georgia incident was corrected in the weeks that followed. Seth Hadley's engineering license was formally reinstated. His name was restored to the original patents on Hydromap's core architecture, replacing the attribution that had been quietly substituted after his suspension. Dean Faber faced federal charges. Pierce Rollins faced civil litigation from Meridian shareholders that his attorneys were not able to resolve quickly or quietly. Lauren held a press conference. She acknowledged, in language she had written herself and had not softened, that her company had operated for years on commercial rights to technology whose original architect had been deliberately erased, and that Meridian Environmental under her leadership had not looked closely enough at how those rights had been acquired. She said the company would do better. She meant every word of it. Seth declined the executive title and the board seat and the corner office that various parties suggested over the following weeks that he had clearly earned. He accepted the role of independent technical director for Hydromap's safety review panel, a position requiring 3 days in Nashville each month, leaving him the rest of his time for his daughter, Maeve, his clients, and the creek that ran along the back of his property in colors that shifted with the season. He kept the Silverado. Lauren drove out to Seth's property on a Thursday, in late March, alone, in a car that was running perfectly. She had verified this twice before leaving Nashville, because she had wanted to be certain. She parked in the gravel lot beside the converted barn and found him finishing a site assessment for a county irrigation district, standing at his tailgate with a survey map spread open in the early spring light. She told him there was nothing wrong with the car. He waited. Well, now. She told him she did not particularly want to make the drive back to Nashville alone, and that she had been wondering for some time where he was headed that afternoon, and whether she might come along. Seth Hadley folded the survey map along its original creases, carefully, the same way he seemed to fold everything, as though the attention paid to small things mattered as much as the attention paid to large ones. He put it in the glove box and walked around to open the passenger door. It was the same door he had opened for her once before, on a flooded road in the afternoon rain, when she had had no other choice in the world. This time she had every choice available to her. She climbed in anyway, because she had finally understood the difference between the two, and had decided it mattered.